Welcome everyone to our new information video. So I'd like to welcome Hayley Webster, who's the manager of the library at Museums Victoria. And today she's going to be talking about heavy metals in books and paper, identification and management of hazardous subjects in the Museum Victoria collection, or as I called it in our Zoom meeting title, Dangerous Museums. So welcome, Hayley, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about this.
Thanks, Ellen. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations where I work and pay my respects to elders past and present. As Ellen said, I'm the manager of the Museums Victoria Library in Melbourne, where we have undertaken a 5-year research project to identify and manage hazardous substances in old books. So I'm thrilled to be able to share a bit more about that with you today through Alia Vic. As you may know, there's been a spate of recent research into what is now known as bibliotoxicology, the study of hazards in books. Initially, this stemmed from research undertaken by Melissa Tadone and Rosie Grayburn at the Winterthur Museum Gallery and Library in Delaware, in the United States. Their 2019 discovery of high levels of arsenic in a book that was being treated for exhibition launched the Poison Book Project, which focused on vibrant green, arsenic-laden, cloth-covered books from the Victorian era. The Poison Book Project took these Victorian cloth bindings as a starting point for their research, and they were particularly interested in the vibrant green covers, which have been found to contain arsenic. The majority of heavily pigmented emerald green books that they identified with arsenic were published between 1840 and 1860. They found that these arsenic-based pigments did not fully bond to the fabric through the colouring and drying process, and over time this led to the surface becoming friable. This means that toxic substances can be more easily disturbed and transferred to other surfaces or to the readers of these books, creating a potential health and safety issue. Since the early days of the Poison Book Project, studies have proliferated in libraries around the world, including the Museums Victoria Library. The initial interest in green arsenic bindings has expanded to include other materials, various shades of book cloth, and a number of different hazards. Bibliotoxicology research is still new, and I think it poses some challenges to our assumptions about books. Books are commonplace items that we often have an intimate relationship with. They are containers of knowledge found in libraries where they are meant to be handled and shared. A fraction of these might be considered rare or historic and may be accessed less frequently and with greater care. But this is to protect the book, isn't it? Whether we handle them casually or with reverence, I think that there is an underlying expectation that books are safe. It's the ideas that have been considered dangerous. The possibility that the physical container might be dangerous too takes some getting used to. In the hand press period, from the 15th century when Gutenberg popularised movable type in Europe until industrialisation in the 19th century, most elements of a book were handmade. In this period, bindings were created by folding and sewing stacks of unbound printed sheets together into gatherings and then attaching these into a book block. Boards were attached to the front and back of the text block. Then the boards and spine were covered, often in leather. However, they could also be bound in other materials such as fabric or paper. Bindings in the hand press period were often made to order by the owner and may have been bound to match a personal library. However, books could also be sold already bound or with a choice of bindings available from the printer or publisher. There were a range of materials and decorative elements available to suit different tastes and budgets. As the book trade industrialised from the early 19th century, books started to be issued with pre-made bindings. Publishers became responsible for bindings rather than individual owners, and book covers started to become more uniform. This shift to publisher bindings led to experimentation and change. Experimentation with materials, especially cloth, which was cheaper than leather, a case binding was developed which could be created separately from the book block and attached afterwards. This sped up the process of book production. Covers also began to more clearly represent the contents of the book. From the 1830s, cloth bindings became increasingly popular with publishers as a more cost-effective option than leather. Book cloth or buckram was invented in the 1820s and was commonly in use by the 1840s for publisher bindings. To attract buyers, they experimented with colourful dyes to create eye-catching covers. Prior to industrialisation, many pigments were created from natural minerals. However, in the 19th century, inorganic pigments were increasingly used, and these could contain heavy metals such as arsenic, lead, chromium, and mercury. The one that drew the initial attention of the Poison Book Project is emerald green, which used copper acetoarsenite. It was created in 1808 to improve upon an earlier green called Sheely's green. It was widely used by 1814 in wallpaper, clothing, furnishings, lolly wrappers, and of course, book cloth. Coloured book cloth was made by treating the fabric with a clear starch paste, followed by a coloured starch paste. This was layered up to achieve the desired level of colour saturation. Each layer of starch paste was dried before the next one was applied. The paste was pressed into the fabric by hot rollers to create a smooth surface or stamped to create a decorative design. Publisher bindings were mass-produced and can be found in many libraries today. Museums Victoria is the most visited museum organisation in Australia and New Zealand and houses over 15 million objects across the collecting disciplines of First Peoples, history and technology, and sciences. Additionally, there is a behind-the-scenes library and historic archive. The Museums Victoria Library is a heritage collection founded in 1854. It was founded as a working library for the 19th century museum scientists, and our collection includes publications from the 17th to 21st centuries. Today, the library consists of around 40,000 titles and includes a rare book collection of over 1,000 titles or 2,000 volumes. Pre-1900 bindings can be found throughout our library collection, including our rare book collection. And the rare book collection has the highest concentration, of course, because it's got most of the older material in it. However, pre-1900 works can also be found throughout our general collection of books and serials. The library's history as a working collection means that some bindings are well worn. Our books have been used alongside specimens in the lab and were sometimes taken out into the field. This history of use means that books can have detached boards and covers with worn or friable surfaces. Museums Victoria has undertaken extensive hazard testing over the past 15 years. However, most of the testing has focused on the museum's scientific, cultural, and historic collections. This was the first project to include the library. Our project was a collaboration between the library and conservation staff. Our materials scientist, Rosemary Goodall, who you can see in the photo here, did the testing and the reporting, and I was responsible for implementing collection management responses to the findings. We have undertaken significant testing of our pre-1900 books and journals since 2020. To identify heavy metals, we used a portable XRF spectrometer and a transportable Fourier transform infrared spectrometer to test for heavy metals. X-ray fluorescent provides information on the elements present, but it doesn't tell us how much is present. Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy can be used to identify the compound used. That's the combination of heavy metals that are present. However, it can only identify it if you have enough of the compound present. So we've found with many of our books, the compound is actually still tightly bound to the book cover and can't be found with the infrared. The testing involves placing the test aperture of the XRF unit against the lower edge of the back cover of each book, as close to the surface as possible to obtain the strongest X-ray signal. We also did wipe testing using a piece of Tyvek. Wipe tests were carried out on book covers, shelving and storage units. The wipe samples were then placed onto the aperture of the XRF unit to take a reading. Taking our lead from the Poison Book project, we also initially focused on green cloth bindings, but quickly expanded the testing to include other colours due to our materials scientists' previous experience testing books and paper-based items. So you'll see here we found arsenic in some paper as well as the fabric book covers. Rosemary was aware that other pigments sometimes contained heavy metals too, such as chromium in some greens and yellows, mercury, mainly from the red pigment vermilion, can also be found in multiple colours, such as red, purple and blue. Mercury is also sometimes found in marbled paper covers. Lead can be found very widely. It's found in certain whites, reds and yellows. As it was used as a drying agent, it was also, and a mordant used to set the pigments and dyes, it's quite commonly found across book collections. The books with heavy metals were concentrated in the mid to late 19th century, as we were expecting from the results of the Poison Book project, mainly 1840 to 1870. However, this does in part reflect the date range that we were testing in. As you can see from the results here, arsenic is clustered around the mid-19th century, as you would expect. The readings don't provide an exact quantity, so the reports that Rosemary produced identified what level a heavy metal was found at. So it was high, moderate, low, trace, or not detected. Overall, the levels were quite low, which was good news, although there were specific items that had higher readings. So here's some of our results. Between 2020 and 2024, we tested 571 pre-1900 volumes. And as you can see, lead was found in almost all of these. Arsenic was found in a little over 10%. That was less than 60 books and none in the high concentration of the emerald green covers that the Poison Book project really highlighted. We found arsenic in other colours though, like I mentioned, green, red, purple, brown and black cloth covers, and some marbled paper covers also were found to contain arsenic. So it doesn't have to be the vibrant green. Mercury we found in a little over 5% and chromium a little bit higher, 21.5%. The heavy metals were found in many different components of the books. Although we focused on testing cloth book covers, we also tested end papers and illustrations. The books with arsenic and mercury were the ones that we were most concerned about. Rosemary's testing showed that arsenic and mercury pigments appear to be less stable, whereas the chromium pigments appear to be better bound to the cover, even after all the time has passed. Once we had the results, we needed to consider what to do. Risks from exposure to heavy metals from handling books is generally quite low. However, as books deteriorate, the pigments containing heavy metals can come loose, and there is the possibility of ingesting those through handling. There's also a risk of contamination if books become wet. High exposure to heavy metals can cause serious health issues. So while the results were not alarming, there's still a health and safety issue for us to consider. I'm incredibly fortunate to work in an organisation where there were already protocols for working with material with hazardous substances, and where there's an amazing team of conservators to consult. So I was able to join the Hazardous Substances Working Group and could base my work on the work that they had already done. We use the hierarchy of controls to minimise exposure to hazards. We've mainly implemented engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE to address this specific hazard. However, there are a couple of points I thought I would mention under elimination and substitution, as they are possibilities. While we have not actively sought to remove affected items from our collection, we do consider hazards at the point of acquisition of historical material now. So we test items as they're added to the collection, and we could, in theory, use that as criteria for exclusion. I sometimes also use substitution as a mitigation strategy by selecting an unaffected copy. You know, if you're lucky enough to have different copies with different bindings, this is definitely doable, and I do this when I can. And the other option would be to use a modern facsimile. There's, you know, again, depending on the circumstances and depending on what you're looking at, there can be some very nice modern facsimiles that you could use for a public program rather than bringing out an affected item. Here are a couple of examples of some engineering controls that can be used for hazardous books. Fume hoods or downdraft labs, that's the first image you can see there, the fume hood. They can be used to assist ventilation and reduce the risk of inhaling particulates or vapours. We in the library would not really use these. It's more when you're working very closely with an item that would have higher readings, but that's certainly something that's a possibility. And in the second image that you can see here, the enclosures that we've used these selectively on items with higher levels of mercury or arsenic. So these were the ones that we were more concerned about. And we've also removed those from open shelving into our collection stores where possible, just to reduce that risk of casual handling. In our rare book collection, we've tried to consolidate as much of the affected material as possible into 2 cabinets, but it's not really practical because there are space limitations, and also particular formats have particular storage needs. So it's handy if you can do it where you can, but yeah, certainly not really practical to do overall, I would say. Yeah, we've left much of the affected material in place in our main library and journal stores. I'll move on to signage, but just before I do, I'll mention that for our particular collection, we are a back of house collection. So this is the type of approach that we've taken is suitable to that sort of collection. And if you were in a public library and you had something that had high levels, you know, you'd probably want to remove it from circulation. Due to the fact that our collections can be accessed by numerous people, we've used a lot of administrative controls and have made a huge improvement to signage. So there are multiple layers of signage in place now outside our collection stores, which you can see in that first image. On our rare book cabinets, which you can see in the second image there. And one of our innovations was to use yellow library shelf markers. So these you normally use when you're marking where you've put a book if you're going to quickly go and put it back on the shelf. The yellow ones really neatly matched up with our hazardous substances signage. So we've used those and we use blue shelf markers instead now, just to keep that clear. So what's handy about this is that before you get to the shelf, you can see that there's something there that has hazardous substances. And as I said, we've left a lot of this material interspersed throughout our collection. So that's kind of important, just so you know, oh, okay, there's something on this shelf that's affected. I'll proceed with a bit more caution here. We have also tagged individual items. The tags tell you a bit more information, like what specific hazards are present. A lot of that other signage that I just showed is a bit more general. But these ones tell you when it was tested, what was found, who did the testing. But of course, you don't see these until you open the book. So that other layer of signage is quite important. Aside from the physical signage, we have updated our catalogue records to flag the presence of hazardous substances before you get to the shelf. We have a generic warning which can be seen in our OPAC, our online public access catalogue. That's the first one that you can see on the screen. We keep this general so as not to cause unnecessary alarm. Some people can react quite strongly to this information, which is just something to bear in mind. In the back end of our system, however, we've got the specific information on which heavy metals have been detected, and a warning to consult safe handling procedures and to wear gloves. These are recorded in a 590 local note that's set to private. Much of the work in this project has been to raise awareness of the issue among staff. At Museums Victoria, we have an internally developed training module that looks at the issue of hazards across collections. So it's not specific to the library, it's across the whole museum collection. This has been completed by library staff, digitisation and photography staff, students, volunteers and contractors working with our collection. We include information on hazardous substances in our store inductions, and we've updated our library procedures. So we've got a new procedure accessing restricted content in the MV library, and our rare book handling guidelines have been updated to include this information too. And yeah, we only really get people to do the training if they're going to work extensively with the collection. It's not necessary for every person, but yeah, if you're going to sort of be handling the collection regularly, then we would undertake some training. One of the main mitigation strategies for managing these materials is to wear PPE, or personal protective equipment. So we use nitrile gloves when handling affected items, and we also wear nitrile gloves when doing work like shelving or a collection move where you don't actually know what you're going to be handling in the collection beforehand. If necessary, we can wear a P2 mask as well. This would be required mainly for items where they're extensively damaged with high readings and of arsenic or mercury. So it wouldn't be necessarily common for us to wear a mask when handling these items. Decontamination is something that's quite important. So we use D-lead to clean non-porous surfaces like desks or tables if we've got something directly that's got hazardous substances that's directly touching that. But if we're using a cushion, which we often do to support the spines of our rare books, we'll use a layer of tissue or Tyvek instead, and then you can just dispose of that and not have to worry about cleaning. We dispose of contaminated PPE in designated hazardous waste bins, which you can see a photo of there. And there's a regular collection of these across the organisation. So some reflections from me on this project after working on it for 5 years. I think it's really important to share what we've learned so that other people are aware of the potential for hazardous substances in library collections and can implement their own mitigation strategies that are appropriate to their collections. Rosemary and I published a journal article on our project last year, which I encourage you all to read, and I recently published a short version in Alia's Insight magazine as well, so you can have a look at that. One thing that this project has really confirmed to me is that you really can't judge a book by its cover. We have found heavy metals in book covers of different materials and colours, and I expect that that will continue to broaden as more research is undertaken in this field, as it's, like I said at the start, this is sort of new. The findings necessitated quite a lot of procedural change, and this takes time to get used to. So we have needed to think through routine activities with more forward planning. For instance, I would check for hazardous substances before providing access to collections, if I'm dealing with historic material, that is. I check the catalogue before I go to the shelf, but even if I'm looking at things on the fly, because of all those layers of signage, there's actually quite a lot of flags in place to sort of make us have a think before we handle things. Some general advice that are a bit more simple and easy to implement would be to wash your hands after handling old books, and not to consume food or drinks near these types of collections. The nitrile gloves are a good protective barrier if you're working with material that you suspect may contain heavy metals. So those vibrant green mid-19th century items, if you've got any of those in the collection, you might want to think about wearing gloves if you haven't tested or don't have the capacity to test. I think it's important to note that in most cases, knowing that something has hazardous substances hasn't actually stopped me from providing access. I just proceed with more caution. So I would say overall, my message is it's a case of being alert and learning about this, but not being alarmed. I will just conclude by saying that from my point of view, this has been a great piece of collaborative interdisciplinary research that has informed and improved our collection management practices at the museum's Victoria Library. So thanks for listening. Here are my references, and I couldn't resist ending this talk without using a lovely GIF that someone made of one of our rare books.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you, Hayley. It's really interesting.